wanted to thank Synergy for giving you some heat today. So I know you're paying your bills, or at least we're paying our bills. Can't thank you enough for showing up in a tough day. A lot of ice out there, and thanks to a guy named John Tinbarge, he got a nice truck and a lot of good salt that cleaned the place up. When you leave, if you want a valet to your car, Mr. Tiemann or Mr. Gross or Mr. Head or Mr. Pitcher will give you a ride to your car. I don't want anybody falling out there, so go slow. There's no rush to get out of here. I don't want anybody falling. So please just be careful. It's still some slippery areas out there. I'll be mad if I see anybody fall. Okay, I just wanted to tell you a couple announcements before you introduce the main speaker here. Next week it will be Don Pitcher. He's our photographer here, and he has the command car that's going to be next to the tank that they're going to talk about in a little bit. But Don Pitcher is going to talk about the signal corps. You all got your own signal right now with your cell phone. It was a little bit different during World War II. I think you'll learn a lot about communication. Communication's everything. I can't communicate very well. You can ask my wife. But I think communication's everything in life, and just simple things get confused. So we'll talk about that next week. Then we got a whole set of other very good people talking. We met with the Frog Follies people. We're going to help sponsor some things with the Frog Follies this year. Love to have you be part of that. And Donna Baldwin let me announce what's coming up in about a month and a half, so you'll have to come back to hear what that announcement is. So I'm supposed to be quiet about that. Just about the Industrial Revolution, first one in 1772, the second one in 1872, and really people learned to leverage energy and leverage things, and really what we're going to hear about is how we leverage things in regards to tanks. But if you think, what's that guy's name? Leonardo da Vinci invented a tank back in the 14 or 1500s, but it couldn't be used because the things were so daggone heavy. The horses would get shot and they were pulling it around. So until the combustible engine became really a practical way of making things happen, that's where a lot of this evolved. And prior to that, just had a bow and arrow and a gun, somebody can knock you off. These things help you from getting knocked off. So it didn't happen until early in the 20th century. But thank you for coming, and my wife said I'm supposed to tell you to try to call her Tuesday or text her or email her Tuesday before the event, or you may not get lunch. There's a few people that we had to hold off lunch on because they didn't text her. So if you would mind texting her so we can get a number count. We're not going to have steak, we're just going to have similar things. Okay. Thank you for all coming, and here's Mr. Kevin Reid. No, you're not going to tell you about Kevin Reid, so I've lost it. This is Kevin Reid. He's been with us for many years. Has been a librarian. He has a master's in military history from Purdue. Don't hold that against him. We got a Purdue tape over here. But that is a decent university with a lot of aeronautics. He's written many articles and encyclopedia essays on World War II. Since the mid-90s, he's volunteered at the Pat Museum. The Pat Museum is over there in Louisville. Fort Knox. Yeah, okay, thank you. Fort Knox and the Cavalry. And it says here, the Armored Division at Fort Knox. He's been over there for a lot of time. And so you're going to have an in-depth talk about tanks. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I very much appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. At the end of it, there will be time if you have any questions. I can try and answer those questions for you. As was said, I have a master's degree in military history with an emphasis on World War II, and at the Pat Museum, the volunteers helped do some restoration on vehicles and also ran vehicles during a number of the demonstration battles they did. So we actually had to get training from the Army on how to work in the vehicles and how to operate the vehicles and take care of them. And one of the things that I really want to get across in today's talk is that one of the things I want to talk about in particular is that many TV documentaries, many books are very focused on different tanks of World War II. They kind of take the sportscaster's view. What's the best tank? How is it the best tank? Which tank beat the other tanks? So you get a lot of things that you can read about, both for hobbyists that make models, hobbyists that do war games like the World of Tanks war games have been very popular in the last 10 years or so, and also lots of books. So I'm hoping that with today's presentation, I'll actually talk through some of that and actually bust a couple of myths about the Sherman tank. So today's focus is on the American Sherman tank and its German opponents, which oftentimes get kind of grouped together as the Tigers and the Panthers. Those are the most famous of the German tanks and the ones that are the most intimidating. The problem is, of course, that talking about that isn't always fair, because most of the German vehicles in World War II, most of the German tanks were not Panthers and Tigers. They only came out in the middle of the war, in the late part of the war, and they did not have the productive capacity that we had. So during the entire war, Germany produced just under 26,000 tanks. In World War II, the United States produced 49,500 and some Sherman tanks alone. That doesn't count the light tanks, that doesn't count the M3 medium tanks before the Shermans, or the M26s that followed the Shermans. It doesn't talk about the tank destroyers. So we outproduced them, that's very true. But in many ways, because our tanks were more durable, more reliable, they tended to be still in the field when a lot of the German tanks were broken down on the side of the field and abandoned by their crews. In fact, for all the Sturm and Drang on how important the Tiger tank was, one of the most interesting statistics I ran into when doing preparation for this is in World War II, the Germans destroyed more Tiger tanks than the Western Allies did. Now think about that for a second. They destroyed more of their own tanks than we did. Why? Because when they broke down and they were retreating, they couldn't keep their own vehicles running long enough to get behind the lines. So rather than giving us a free Tiger tank, they blew them up in place. So they blew up more than we did. So yeah, they might be, real technological marvels, but there are also some problems involved with it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the myths of the Sherman tank first, and then we'll talk about the realities. So one of the things about the Sherman is, if you watch TV shows, they talk all about the Shermans being death traps. Shermans always caught on fire when they got shot by the Germans. Shermans caught on fire because they used gasoline engines. And the Shermans couldn't penetrate the German armor, and the Sherman tank gunners were scared, and the tank crewmen were scared of the Tigers and Panthers. And in fact, so many of the Shermans caught on fire that they got nicknamed by some of the troops the Runs, like the old lighters. They light the first time every time. Or the Germans used to refer to them as the Tommy cookers. Now, why Tommy cookers? Because the Germans referred to the British troops as Tommies. And by the middle of World War II, the bulk of the British tanks being used in the war were produced by the United States of America. So while the United States used Shermans, so did the British. So hence you'll hear the term Tommy cooker. All right. Now, interestingly enough, we didn't actually originally call them Sherman tanks. That's another one of the myths. In the United States Army, the nomenclature or the naming system said that every tank would have a number. An M, which means model, followed by a number. So you'd have the M3 light tank. You'd have the M3 medium tank. You'd have the M4 medium tank. And the British couldn't keep all that straight, so they started assigning the names of Civil War generals to our tanks. So they called the M3 light tank the Stuart, after Jeb Stuart, the Confederate general in the Civil War. The M3 medium tank got called by the British the Lee tank or the Grant tank, after those two Civil War generals. And the M4 became the M4 Sherman. Now everybody calls them Shermans, but originally during most of the first part of the war, if you read American accounts, we talked about M4s and so forth. You'll also see a lot of weird abbreviations. For example, the tank we have here in the museum is an M4A4. Well, what the heck does that mean? It's an M4 medium tank variety or version, if you will, for. What are the differences? The differences are the engines that were used. So when we started building when we started building the Sherman tanks, in order to make them fast and powerful, we wanted to put in the lightest power engine, or the lightest engines we could find that were the most powerful. So the logical thing was to use airplane engines, radial airplane engines, much like we have in the fighter planes of World War II, like the P-47 and so forth. So the problem was, while we're building radial engines for the Shermans, remember, roughly 50,000 Shermans, we also wanted a lot of airplanes in the air, and not only the fighter planes like the P-47, but also the bombers like the B-17s and the B-24s needed the radial engines too. So the model M4 and M4A1 had radial engines. The model M4A2 had a diesel engine. The model 4 A3 had a 8-cylinder truck engine, and the Model 4A4 had what they called the multi-bank engine, which was 5 6-cylinder car engines, all chained together in a big pentagon to power the tank. Ours was an M4A4, so originally it had the multi-bank engine. And for any of you that might be, say, mechanics, even, yard variety mechanics, imagine taking 5 engines all working the same crankshaft and tuning them so they all run properly. Must have been a real nightmare to do. But most of the mechanics had obviously had their own cars, so they knew how to tune them and work on them. So they were simple enough in many ways to work on, and a lot of the spare parts that would have been used in any normal car engine, you could use in your Sherman engine as well. So it made it very productively useful. And so that's what we have in the collection here. Many of the multi-bank engines were complex enough, though, that the troops weren't happy about getting in the field, so a lot of those were used as training tanks and stayed in the United States. The British also seemed to like the M4A4, and so a lot of the M4A4s went as Middle-East to the British. So some confusion arises. Also, the Shermans evolved. During the war, the Americans found out that the 75 millimeter initially mounted on the Sherman had some limitations, so they went to what they called the 76 millimeter. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So you have a variation of an M4A3E8, which is the truck engine with the 76 millimeter cannon on it. So you have all kinds of variations. Sometimes those will be called the Easy 8s. And for those of you that are interested in tank history and so forth, if you go up in Vincennes to the Indiana Military Museum, they have an M4A3E8, what's called an Easy 8 Sherman with a long barrel cannon on it. So you can compare that with our Sherman here. So there's lots of things you can learn about the Sherman. They're a very complex tank. And with, again, just shy of 50,000 made, there's a lot of different models and a lot of variations in turret size and turret shape and so forth. Okay. So, myth number 1. The Sherman was always outclassed. True out and out falsehood. The Shermans did not have the same high velocity cannons that many of the German tanks had, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But we had better high explosive capability. We kept more Shermans in the field, so in any given battle, more Shermans were still running while the Germans were broken down. All right. So let's talk a little bit about tank guns. One of the things you're going to see is that everybody talks about the Sherman having a 75 millimeter cannon. That's true. There's a problem. All 75 mm means, or 75 millimeter means, is that's the diameter of the shell case, or the diameter of the projectile. So, this is a 75 millimeter. This is an enlarged 75 millimeter. We call it a 76, so the troops wouldn't get confused. This is a German 75 millimeter, and this is a German 75 millimeter. So just calling it 75 millimeter doesn't make much difference, does it? What makes the difference is the length of the cartridge case, which means how much powder you can put in it, and the length of the barrel that you're firing it from. The longer the barrel, the more the projectile spins, and the more velocity the projectile gets. Now, in World War II, most anti-tank guns, like 80% of the anti-tank guns, fired a solid piece of steel. So, for example, here's the Sherman, armor-piercing round. It is a solid piece of steel that weighs 12.5 pounds. The higher the velocity it goes, what happens is when it hits the steel armor of the enemy tank, it bowls its way through, smashing through the other armor. When it does that, as it goes through, at the front end of the projectile, as it's digging through, you'll get little shavings of metal that are broken apart as it breaks through the armor, all of which are superheated by the friction of the round going through. Once it gets inside the tank, what does all that stuff do? It bounces around inside the tank until the soft, squishy things inside the tank slow them down. Or until it runs into something inside the tank that might also be, well, dangerous. So what happens is all those hot pieces of metal start bouncing around inside the tank. It's very hard on the crew. Let's talk a little bit of metallurgy for just a second. All of the rounds that you're going to fire in your tank have to be stored somewhere in the tank. And if you look at this, your average shell case is made out of brass. Brass is a soft metal. When a hot piece of steel hits brass, it's going to burn right through that thin brass wall. And what's inside this brass? Lots of gunpowder. Now, the myth is that the Shermans always burned because they used gas engines. Well, let's be honest about it. The Shermans all used gas engines. That's true, except for the ones that had the diesel engines. All the German tanks used gas engines as well. All the British tanks used gas as well. So what makes the Sherman different? Not a damn thing as far as that goes. The explosions that happened inside the Sherman were primarily because the ammunition storage was relatively limited. Now, later today when I'm done speaking, go and look at our M4A4, and you'll see there's big panels of metal that have been welded in places on the hull of the Sherman tank. Those are storage areas where ammunition was stored. And we got smart and put thicker armor over the over the ammunition so that the hot pieces of metal wouldn't be getting to them and starting to fire. Later in the war, the M4A3E8, the EZ8s, also had what they called wet stowage. Research during the war said, hey, this is dangerous. So what they did is they moved ammunition storage from the size of the chassis into a bucket underneath the turret that was filled with basically what looks like a honeycomb. And in that honeycomb, each round would be set at an angle, and the honeycomb would be filled with, well, essentially radiator fluid, water. And all those hot pieces of metal zinging about, they hit the water and they quench immediately. And when they hit the brass, they wouldn't burn through the brass and ignite it. So research during the war showed that on average about 60 to 70% of the Shermans that got hit by armor-piercing weapons would in fact ultimately burn. The burn was the ammunition, not the gasoline. When they went to the wet stowage, rather than the 60 to 70%, or I'm sorry, 40 to 60% of the Shermans that burned, it went down to 6 to 8% of the Shermans combusted. So the problem was the ammunition storage, not the gasoline. So that's number one broken. Another thing about tanks and tank guns is, what do you fire? The reality is, in World War I, the tanks were designed first as a way to cross the mud, drive through the barbed wire, and shoot at the enemy machine guns. So if you look at the early World War I tanks, a lot of them carried just machine guns to shoot at enemy infantry. In World War I, there's only 7 documented tank versus tank battles. The very first one had a grand whopping total, count them, 6 tanks involved in the fight. 6 full tanks. Okay? Most of the time, what you're doing is you're actually fighting the enemy infantry, the enemy artillery, the enemy bunkers, the enemy supplies infrastructure, and all those sorts of things. Now, that means that most of the time what you're firing, if you're in a tank in World War II, is not armor-piercing rounds like that, but high-explosive rounds like this. What do I mean by high-explosive rounds? You'll note at the front, they have a fuse that will set when the projectile goes off. Inside, you have a big open space you can fill with gunpowder. Those high-explosive rounds are set to explode near the target, and so the explosion, the shock wave, fragmentation from that is what does the damage. Not punching a hole through a piece of armor like armor-piercing does. During the war, one of the things you'll find is that the average load on a Sherman tank was roughly 60 to 70% high-explosive rounds, 10 to 15% armor-piercing rounds, and 10 or so percent smoke rounds. So you can actually hide in the smoke. So if you're firing 60 or more percent of your ammunition as high explosives, how often are you running into tanks? Not very often. So one of those myths is that yes, there was a lot of tank versus tank fighting in World War II, but it was on a small scale. A tank here, a platoon of 4 or 5 tanks there, only in a few cases do we run into masses of German tanks. And so what was most useful for the troops in the field, including in the tanks, was high explosive capability, not armor piercing. Now, another problem is that if you have a high explosive compound inside something like this and it's going really, really fast, it tends to blow up, like in a barrel. That's not really very good. So what you do is the higher the velocity of the cannon, the smaller the area of high explosive, because the wall has to be thicker to act as a cushion for the high explosives. More about that in a few minutes. Okay, when World War I ended, everybody started thinking about tanks being really important. So the British wrote about tanks, the Germans wrote about tanks, some Americans started looking at it, the Russians wrote about tanks, and everybody came up with it, trying to decide what you would need your tanks to do. The answer to that is what the Army calls doctrine. The doctrine is the playbook that the Army gives its troops and says, this is the way we want you to fight. In the British Army, when they looked at tanks, they decided they'd have 2 kinds of tanks to fight. They have slow tanks that would go through the mud and attack enemy fortifications. They were called infantry tanks. They'd have thicker armor, maybe a lot of machine guns, because there's going to be a lot of infantrymen out there. But they really aren't supposed to fight other tanks. They're just supposed to do breakthroughs in fortified positions. Then for speeding around outside the battlefield, you'd have what they call cavalry tanks, what we in America call light tanks. Those would be a lot faster, but they would be smaller and lighter, because if they move really quickly, it's hard for the enemy to target them. And, not necessarily surprisingly, since we're talking about the 1920s and 1930s, they would be cheaper to make. A light tank, which has less armor and is lighter, is easier to move, faster to produce, a harder target to shoot at, but of course it doesn't have as much armor. So that's a problem. In the United States, we had light tanks, which the British would have called cavalry tanks, and then we had medium tanks, which is the ones that would be the assault tanks, and then eventually we started talking about heavy tanks. The Germans kind of had the same idea, the Russians did too, and one of the things that we ran into during World War II is there's this basic problem. If you build a specialized tank, like light tanks that are just supposed to run around where the enemy tanks aren't, what happens if you run into something you're not expecting? You don't have the right tank for the battle. So you keep all your light tanks in the back waiting for a breakthrough and only use your medium tanks? Well, if you're only going to use your medium tanks, why do you build light tanks? And how do you decide how many tanks you need? And each of the countries looked at that. The American Sherman was one of the best mixes in terms of mobility, producibility, reliability, and mobility. So they could move fairly quickly, they could actually stand up to a lot of enemy fire, they could go through the mud and all those sorts of things. As the war went on in World War II, more and more we found that specialized tanks, like tank destroyers or light tanks, oftentimes were not the right tank for the right job. And so rather than having a special tank for a special job, what you needed was what in the 1960s they called a main battle tank. One tank that has a decent gun, decent armor, decent mobility, and is capable of doing whatever it needs to be done. So a specialized tank doesn't work very well. So one of the problems when you look at the Germans, they decided they wanted breakthrough tanks. That's what the Tiger was designed to be. Very thick armor, a little bit slower because it's very thick, it's a lot heavier, and a really big cannon. But they're very expensive to make, they're hard to move, they can't go on some bridges because the bridges collapse underneath them. And you also have a problem. The bigger your tank gets, the heavier it is, but motors in the 1940s are only so powerful. If you get too heavy of a tank, it doesn't move very fast. So your Sherman tank in World War II weighed, depending on the model, between about 30 and 34, 35 tons. The Tiger tank that everybody talks about weighed 56 tons. Now think about what kind of an engine it takes to move that, and think about all the stresses. So, how do you drive a Sherman tank, or a Tiger tank for that fact? When you're driving a tank, if you want to turn this way, you lock one track so it stops, and the other tank turns, or the other tread turns like this. If you want to turn the other direction, you lock this tank, and this one goes forward. Well, there's all kinds of stress on your transmission when you lock one side and try to drive the other way. Now try to do that and try to stop quickly a 56-ton tank, or a 30-ton tank, which is going to break down first. So you have a problem with that. The other thing is, the heavier the tank, the more it actually sinks into the ground. So what did the Germans do? When they had the heavy tanks, like the Tiger tanks and the slightly lighter at 45-ton Panther tanks, is what they would do is they would have big wide tracks spread the weight across the ground. Now, there was a problem for the Germans. Most of the tanks can't drive that far on their own before the engines wear out. Okay? If you buy a car today, Subaru or Toyota or whatever, how long is that engine good for? 100,000, 200,000 miles, more or less? Average Tiger or Panther, the engine was good for about 1,000 miles. Now you drive in the field up and down or the road back and forth and across, it doesn't take very long to run into 1,000 miles. What happens? You have to stop and rebuild the engine or take the engine out and put a new engine in. Sherman could do 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000 miles before breaking down and worrying about that. So again, there's a problem. The other thing is, because you're not going to drive everywhere in your tank, you're going to move the tank by a tank transporter, or more often by railroad, to the battlefront. Now, here's the fun part of the Tiger tank. Because the tracks are so wide, the Tiger tank itself gets very wide. Wider, in fact, if it's going to be on its combat tracks, than the tunnels in Germany. So in order to be able to transport the tanks, every Tiger tank was issued with two sets of tank tracks, what they called the combat tracks and what they called the transportation tracks. With the transportation tracks, they drive from the factory to the rail yard. They would drive onto the rail car, and then a set of combat tracks would be put on the flatbed next to them, and you do that for your entire battalion, which is roughly 60 tanks. They would then go to the front, wherever that is, say in Russia, right? Then they drive off the flat cars, and you go into the rail yard, and you drive off your transport tracks, lay out your combat tracks, drive onto them, reattach them, and then somebody rolls up your transportation tracks and puts them in a truck. You go forward to the battlefield, you fight however long you fight, and when it comes time to move, you go back to the railroad yard line. Then your trucks with the transport tracks, lay them out, you drive off your combat tracks, you drive onto your transport tracks, they go up onto the train, and you repeat as often as necessary. One of the things that the Germans found out was that the Tigers were very impressive. They had very thick armor, 4 inches or more, depending on whether you're talking about the Tiger 1 or the Tiger 2, what we call the King Tiger. They had 4 inches of frontal armor on the Tiger 1, 6 inches on the Tiger 2 or King Tiger. The Sherman had just under 3 inches of frontal armor. So obviously the Tiger had a lot more armor. But think about all the time that's wasted for the crews having to shift these tracks back and forth. And what happens if you hit a mine and the tank track blows up and you're stuck in the field? We're back to why did they destroy so many of their own Tiger tanks? You can't move them. Because when the Germans invented the Tiger, they didn't build a tank transporter for the Tiger or a tank recovery vehicle. So when it breaks down in the field, how do you get it? You take 6, count them, 6 of the big half tracks, nose to tail. They run a chain back to the Tiger and they drag it to wherever the repair facility is. 6. So you can begin to see why the Tiger may sound impressive, but it had feet of clay in a lot of respects. That being said, the Panthers and the Tigers did have heavy firepower. So let's talk a little bit about firepower right now. Originally, when World War II began, let's actually talk terminology for a second. We talked about describing the Shermans and the various models of Shermans. How did the Germans designate their tanks? The German word for tanks is Panzer. So the very first design they had was what the Americans and the British called the Panzer I. Then they had the Panzer II, which had a 20mm cannon. The Panzer I had 2 machine guns. Then they had the Panzer III, which had a 50mm cannon. Then they had the Panzer IV, which had a short-barreled 75mm cannon that fired only high explosive rounds to support the attack. They weren't actually supposed to be fighting other tanks. They were only supposed to support acting as mobile artillery, basically. As the war went on and they ran into the French, who had thicker armor on their tanks, or more importantly, in 1941, the Russians, who had the T-34 tanks and the KV heavy tanks, which had more armor than the German 37mm anti-tank gun could penetrate, the Germans had to come up with a solution. So what they started doing was they started getting a bigger 75mm cannon in their Panzer IV tanks. Now, that's what this would have actually been fired from. Still 75mm, but notice how much bigger the shell is. It means you have to change the chamber, and more importantly, you have a long barrel. So when you're looking at the names of guns, the gun is indicated not only by the diameter of the case, i.e. 75mm, then you'll see an L and then a number. In the case of the Sherman, this would be an L40. Okay, that means 40 times the diameter of the shell case is the length of the barrel. This is an L24. When we get to the German Panzer IVs that are outgunned, what we refer to as the Panzer IV Specials, this is an L48. So it's a lot longer, has a lot more gunpowder. By the time the Germans realized they were being outgunned, they started emphasizing tank-to-tank capabilities, even though most of their tanks were still fighting infantry and fortifications and so forth. But when you run into enemy tanks, you want to be able to stop them. So they started emphasizing bigger and bigger guns. They also wanted to have Nazi propaganda involved. So they started coming up with cool sounding, terrifying names. So the German Panzer V became what the Germans called the Panther tank. Now a lot of people get Panzer and Panther confused. A Panther is a Panzer V. A Tiger is a Panzer VI. And the cannon gets even bigger. This is an 88mm anti-aircraft gun that they put in the tank. And it's an L56, so it's got a big long case and a big cartridge that it fires out of it. Compare that with the Sherman's anti-tank round here. And this bad boy at 21 pounds is what they fired out of an 88. When you look at the Sherman, the high explosive one, it's firing at just over 2,000 feet per second. When you look at this, it's fired out at 3,100 and some feet per second. So it's a lot faster, it's going to penetrate a lot longer, it has a long barrel. But with a long barrel, it means the turret turns slower too. So in tank versus tank combat, in the field, the Sherman turret could turn faster. The Sherman was faster than the Panther or the Tiger, and it had high explosive capability for dealing with enemy artillery the fortifications, and the infantry and so forth. Whereas the German tanks were more and more maximized for anti-tank usage and therefore fired smaller charges that were high explosive. The United States started realizing that we might be running into more heavily armed German tanks. So in 1944, the Ordnance Department introduced what they called the 76 millimeter gun that would go on the Shermans. That's what's on the EZ-8 Sherman. We call it 76, though it's actually 75 millimeters in diameter. It's the same basic diameter. But so the troops wouldn't get confused and try to put 76 millimeter rounds in a 75 millimeter cannon, we call it a 76, so you know it's a different round. But you'll notice it's a lot longer. The projectile is going to be roughly the same size and weight, but because it's going so much faster, it has a much smaller high explosive charge. So in the original Sherman 75 millimeter, the high explosive charge out of this round is just over 1.5 pounds of high explosive compound, basically TNT compound. In the 76, it's 0.8 pounds of high explosive. So again, this is going to do better at penetrating enemy tanks, but it's not going to do as good in the field against enemy artillery, enemy infantry, and so forth. But you can begin to see, even during the war, the Shermans are upgrading and getting bigger and stronger. We also had a specialized tank that came out in 1944 called the Jumbo Sherman, which had up to 4 inches of armor. The problem with all that, of course, is who's going to build the tanks, and how are you going to ship them, and how many of the heavier tanks can you fit in, for example, an LST. So there's a whole lot of reasons why the Americans continued to use the Shermans, even in spite of the German gunpowder. You'll also see at the very tail end of the war, we introduced a tank destroyer firing a 90 millimeter cannon. It was called the M36 Jackson, and you'll notice here's the cartridge case for a 90 millimeter. You can see how much bigger it is than the 88. It's longer, it's bigger in diameter, and it could start penetrating a lot more of the German tanks. So you can see during the war that the Americans did continue to evolve the Shermans. It wasn't just one model Sherman. Now, on the TV documentaries and so forth, they talk about the Shermans, that all Shermans were the same, and they're not. So the important takeaway on all this is, A, the Americans did understand what was going on, B, they did improve things, and C, there's also what did the troops in the field want, what did the commanders in the field want. In 1943, when the Ordnance Department first started thinking about the 76 millimeter cannon, tankers like Patton said, no, we don't want higher velocity, we want high explosive capability. So before the Normandy landing, there was a decision in the United States Army not to go to the 76 millimeter because they wanted more firepower against the targets they expected to run into. So let's talk about the strategy of the war and reality. In World War II, every army had what they called divisions. That's the basic building block of an army. Roughly a division is a group of about 12 to 18,000 men. The Germans in the years before World War II decided they wanted to concentrate their tanks in what they called Panzer divisions. A Panzer division wasn't just a collection of tanks. That's a myth. They had tanks. The original pre-World War II German tank or Panzer division had roughly 200 to 260 tanks in a division. They also had 5,000 to 6,000 other vehicles in that division. Trucks, motorcycles, armored cars, half-tracks, repair trucks, transporters, etc., to move. They were very, very mobile. During World War II, the Germans mobilized roughly 300 divisions. Of those 300 divisions, 25 were Panzer divisions. Do the math here. You had 25 Panzer divisions, you had 14 what they call Panzer Grenadier divisions, which are basically what we would call mechanized infantry divisions. And the other, 230 divisions, 240 divisions were infantry divisions. Each infantry division would have a tank company or a tank battalion. 30 to 40 tanks at most in that division. Now, if 230 divisions, the German army, which is 2/3 the German army, are infantry tank divisions, how often are we going to run into German tanks? Not very many, and when we do, they're going to be in small penny packets, 2 or 3 tanks here, 4 or 5 tanks there. So again, the decision for high explosives and mobility is certainly going to be more important than anticipating lots of tank versus tank battles. In fact, if you look at the end of the war, there were really 4, 5 major battles in which the United States faced concentrations of German tanks. The first counterattack after we broke out of the Normandy bridgehead, a battle called Wartime. The Germans lost it terribly because with American air support, the Germans couldn't concentrate their troops, so they'd have a battalion attacking American division here, a battalion attacking there, and they get swatted like flies. That was in late July of 1944. In September of 1944, as we started romping through France, Patton's Third Army ran into a massed German counterattack that had been hidden from us, where we ran into a number of German panzer brigades. And in fact, this massive German counterattack never even made notice to our intelligence officers as a basic battle because we kept tearing apart the small German units that we ran into. Then at the Battle of the Bulge, you have large numbers of German tanks. And then there's another counterattack that the Germans launched as a surprise attack in January of 1945 called Operation Northwind. Those were the only real battles in which we ran into large numbers of German tanks. Throughout the rest of the war, in Italy and in northern France, Belgium, Holland, and in Germany itself, we ran into small contingents of German tanks. So even if they may have had better firepower for anti-tank usage, it was only in limited numbers. In fact, German doctrine said that most of the German defenses against tanks should be German anti-tank guns. And therein lies the problem because they used the long-barreled 75 millimeters as anti-tank guns, and they also used 88 millimeters as anti-tank guns. Those would be in place and hidden, so they'd be in ambush positions, and that caused a lot of problems for us. When they were found, American artillery, American air power, and the mobility of the Shermans meant that we could outrun them, out-concentrate them, and overwhelm them, which is how they lost. Okay, back to the inside of the tank. Tanks look huge, but there's a lot of things about how a tank actually functions. Inside a tank, like our Sherman, you have a crew of 5 men. A driver, a co-driver, and 3 people sitting inside the turret. Now when you look at that tank, it looks big, it looks huge. Put 5 men in there, plus all their personal gear like sleeping bags, canteens, maybe a cooking pot or something like that in their rations. Oh, and then let's see, if you've got a 75 millimeter cannon, 97 rounds for the tank gun. If you have a 76 millimeter, 71 rounds for the tank gun. 5,000 or 6,000 rounds for the machine guns, 160 gallons of gasoline, a radial engine, a transmission, spare parts as you may need, extra tools as you may need, and fit all of that into that Sherman tank and then move it around and fight in it, and then live out of it day by day by day. And what you'll find is that the Shermans were very cramped, and even though roomier than the German models, which were shorter and smaller, they still were very uncomfortable and very difficult to operate with. I have also some examples of the optics that were used. So when you look at this piece here, this is actually a tank sight from a Sherman tank. It would be located right next to the barrel of the cannon, and the gunner could look through it. And when I'm done with the talk today, you can come and look at things at the table, and you're more than welcome to look through the sight and see how clear the sight is or isn't. But imagine if you're in a tank, you don't exactly have a window. So how do you see outside the tank? If you're in battle and the enemy's shooting at you, you close all the hatches so nothing comes in and hits you. Then how do you look out the tank? You use a periscope like this. And again, you can pick this up and look through it. And I really recommend people take a moment to do so and actually try to look across the field with this and see how limited your view is. You can't see below you, you can't see above you, because this goes this way and this way a little bit, but that's it. That's your only visibility, unless you're a gunner and then you have a telescope like this on the side. That's it. You may wonder what the top item is. This is actually a German sight from an anti-aircraft gun, a 37mm anti-aircraft gun. I put it up so you can compare their optics with our optics, and also so I can explain my failing as a collector. I do have a Sherman sight. It's unfortunately an incomplete sight. Every sight actually has a grid on it that they call a reticle. It's a series of numbers that the gunner can use when they look at the target to guesstimate the distance to the target, so you can set the fuse properly, or you can elevate properly. And the gradations on that will identify what you need to set the gun at, what you need to set the sights at. The Sherman sight that I bought for a good price didn't have a reticle on it. So it's got nice clear optics, but you can't really figure your distance to the enemy target. In the German one, you can actually see there's two sets of numbers. One set is for the anti-tank projectile, one set is for the high explosive projectile, because they're different weights. And the different numbers indicate at what range you can fire them and how far you have to elevate the gun in order to hit your target. So it begins to tell you that for the people fighting in the tanks, they are a very technical field. And the most technical position in the tank was that of the gunner. So when you talk about the dynamics of a tank, you have a tank commander, he's the guy that sits in the middle and tells everybody else what to do. And number two man is the gunner. He's got his own sight, but he also is a technical grade soldier. So oftentimes they're sergeants. Then your loader in the turret is lower rank. Then your driver would be number three man in the crew, and the newest guy in the crew is usually the bow gunner, who has a machine gun with no sight at all. You simply watch the tracers go into the enemy target, and you adjust your right, left, up, down by where the tracers go. Now, what's the point of having a machine gun like that? The machine gun in the bow is to be used to hose down enemy infantry. The other reality of tank fighting is that tanks don't fight by themselves. Tanks fight as a team. Organizationally, every tank army out there has platoons, usually 4 or 5 tanks. 3 or 4 platoons make a company, which is roughly 20 or 30 tanks. 3 companies make a battalion, and that's how they're organized. The tanks don't go out and fight by themselves, they fight as a unit. So this tank can watch what this tank is doing and help this tank by protecting them from the enemy fire and so forth, and they're all working. They're also working with infantrymen, because the other threat are the bazookas. And with that limited visibility that you see out of that periscope, you can't see very easily when enemy infantry come by. So you actually use your infantry to protect the tank from the enemy bazookas, and your tank to protect your infantry from the enemy artillery and machine gun positions. So the reality of World War II is the Army that was most efficient at what we call combined arms, where the infantry worked with the tanks, with the artillery, with the aircraft, so that you have a synergy of all the components of the Army working together. That's the Army that wins. And that's how we defeated the Germans. It wasn't by German technological superiority or by American technological superiority. It was all those branches working together with good communications, with good training. Now you can wrap that up in a way. At the end of the war, both the British and the American armies did very serious tests on how effective their tanks were and how you could determine what tanks would be most successful. In tank versus tank combat in particular, the end result was the finding that the tank that sees the enemy first, fires first, and hits first wins. It doesn't matter if the enemy has a super tank. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a Panther tank or a Tiger tank or a Sherman tank or a Panzer IV or a Panzer I with 2 machine guns. If they see the target first and hit it first, the target dies. And that comes down to training, good optics, good cooperation within the tank. Well, what do I mean by cooperation within the tank? The tank commander, you'll see in most photos, actually is sitting with his head and shoulders out of his hatch. So he can look all around the battlefield and see everything that's going on. And he can identify the target over there that's getting ready to shoot them, and he can yell to the gunner what to fire at the range, and he can yell to the loader what kind of projectile to put in the cannon. Now, if you work together well with the team, not only is he watching his tank, but he's watching the other tanks in the platoon, and they're communicating with one another with radios. Another American superiority that nobody talks about, radios, communications, signals. In World War II, the Russians only had one radio per company. The British and the Germans started the idea of one radio per tank, and the Americans entered that in a great big way. So every tank can communicate with every other tank. We also had an intercom. In World War I, the intercom didn't exist because the tanks had just been introduced. So how did the tank commander tell the driver where to go? In the early World War I French Renault light tanks, which had a two-man crew, the tank commander kicked the right shoulder to turn right, the left shoulder to turn left, lower in the back to back up, higher in the back to stop. And pray to God that your tank commander doesn't get too terribly excitable during battle. Okay? The Americans had radios for the unit, but they also had an intercom, which is why if you look at a tank helmet, you have these flaps hanging down. Well, the flaps actually hold a speaker for your radio that plugs in the back of the hat so you can hear what you're being told what to do. Because when you're operating a tank and bullets are bouncing off the arm and your engine's revving and it's hot and you can't tell what's going on, you can hear easily. For those armies that didn't have those kind of communications, it was very difficult, in fact, to operate in tanks effectively, which is why some of the armies, like, for example, the Russian army, took a lot of casualties and didn't do really spectacular tactics because they couldn't communicate well enough to coordinate the actions of all the various tanks out there. And the Germans were smart enough to figure out, if they're all coming in one line, we can set up a couple of anti-tank guns and we can destroy a lot of the German tanks. So tactics are tied to cooperation of the arms and to the coordination of the unit, of the man within the individual tanks. So a couple other things. Sherman tanks. Not only did they equip the United States Army, they were also very important for the British. That was their standard medium tank for most of World War II. They also were sent in large numbers to, smaller numbers to the Chinese, in large numbers to the Free French forces, because the French had a number of divisions that were fighting alongside us, as well as the Free Polish forces. And in the post-World War II years, tanks went to countries like Greece, Cyprus, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, South Vietnam, South Korea, India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to look at the legacy of the Sherman tank, it isn't just the fights in World War II. They're important, and that's something we obviously focus on here. The last time Sherman tanks were effectively used in battle was not in 1945 at the end of World War II, but in 1973 during the Arab-Israeli War, where the Israelis were still using rebuilt, refurbished American Sherman tanks that had been built in World War II or in the immediate post-war years. Now, interestingly enough, they also faced a couple of German tanks that were being used by the Syrians. And you're thinking, oh, they must have been Tigers and Panthers. Those are the big tanks, right? No, they were Panzer IVs, because Panzer IVs kept running. The Tigers and the Panthers kept breaking down. In the immediate post-war years, the British tried to have a unit of Panthers as a test bed. The French tried to run a battalion of Panthers as a way to not have to build more of their own tanks. And the Russians tried a couple battalions of captured Panthers, as did the Bulgarians. And in all four cases, so many Panthers kept breaking down that they didn't actually use them in the field. So yes, while the books may say the Panther was one of the best tanks of the war, it had a lot of power, had good armor, had good designs. The reality is it was the Sherman that kept running and kept winning. The last bit, bring back to the idea of Evansville and Evansville production. Shermans could be built at a reasonable price and in reasonable amounts. In Germany, the time and resources it took to build one Tiger tank was the same as what it would take to build 3 to 4 tank destroyers, what they call the Sturmgeschütz. So for every one Tiger in the field, you could have 4 lesser famous tanks or tank destroyers who would do a good job in the field. And because of the mechanical problems, the best readiness rate in Tiger battalions was about 40 to 45%. So if you had a tank battalion of supposedly 60 Tiger tanks, at any one point you might have 25 running. Whereas your Sturmgeschützen were running about 80 to 90%. So not only is it one Tiger costs the same as 4 as the Sturmgeschütz, but one Tiger battalion would be the same as almost 4 full-powered battalions operating in the field. And the same thing holds true with the Panthers. They got up to about 60 to 65% readiness rates. I bet you're going to be surprised, y'all, from what I've been talking about. Readiness rates for the American Sherman battalions ran around 90 to 92%. So, at the end of the day, if you want to use the poker standards, when we were playing poker against the Germans, the best they could hope for was maybe 3 of a kind, and we always had a full house or better. That's the answer to why the Sherman beat the Panthers and how they should beat the Panthers. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
The tanks that were rebuilt here in Evansville had continental engines. But I've also read that Ford built large flathead engines, and Cadillac also built engines that were used in tanks. Could you expand on that a little bit? I have another question.
As to the Cadillacs, most of those went into the M24. Good question. Good point. Sorry. The question is, the Shermans that were rebuilt here, what kind of engines were they using? Were they using Cadillac engines, or were they using Ford flathead engines? Ford engines were used in a number of Shermans. What they were doing here with the tanks was they were refurbishing them with the engines they started with. As far as the Cadillac engines go, most of those went in the M24 Chaffee light tanks that were introduced late in the war. And again, it depends on which model of Shermans you're talking about. A number of the ones that were refurbished here were the M4A4s that started with the multi-bank engines, and then they got replaced with the Ford GAA engines. And so some of those are put in.
The other question I have is, Victor Davis Hanson talks all the time about this British gun that was incorporated in the Sherman tank that was built in Great Britain. Which caliber was it, and how is it different from what we use? How many did they actually convert?
That's a really, really good question. So I'm going to start by confusing the waters just a little bit, and bear with me. The British designation for their guns was not by caliber initially, but by the weight of projectile. So the big thing the British ran into in North Africa was they were frightened by the German anti-tank guns. So the British, introduced what they called the 17-pounder gun, which was a 76.2 millimeters in diameter, roughly the same size as our 76, but about 20% longer, and they compressed the ammunition in it so that it fired a lot faster. They also introduced what's called a saber round, which is a hard steel piece surrounded by essentially a ceramic outside that's lighter. So you can have all the power of that projectile in a smaller projectile, and it flies a lot faster. So the 17-pounder, that was the weight of the projectile overall, actually fired out about 3,900 feet per second. The 88 we were talking at was 3,150 some feet per second. The Sherman 75 was 2,400 feet per second. So the 17-pounder was a more effective anti-tank weapon. Two problems. First, smaller explosive charge, even smaller than the US 76, about 2/3 of a pound, less than the 8/10 of a pound that we had in the 76. The other reason the other issue is the British called their Shermans that had the 17-pounder the Fireflies. Why did they call them Fireflies? When they fired, you have so much recoil force, there's not much room inside the turret. So they actually had to cut out the back of the turret and put an extension in it so the gun could recoil. And it actually, the breech would open while the gases were still burning, and so you would actually get British crewmen talked about seeing flames looking around the inside of the turret when they fired the gun. And if you looked at the crewmen on a Sherman Firefly, most of them didn't have eyebrows because they'd been burned off. Now, having said that, their penetration was as good as or slightly better than the first version of the 88, not quite as good as the second version of the 88. The problem was the British only had so much capacity to build them, and while they had talked about offering reverse lend-lease, they didn't have the productive capability for their own army, much less ours. So there was no real call for that to happen. Really good question, thank you. Other questions? Yes?
Before he gets to the next question, we're going to have a hat passed out, or 4 hats, in case you've got any spare change in your pocket. It helps keep things going for the museum. So the hats will be passed by. Then continue on the questions here. I have a question before you start yours. Mrs. Howe asked a question about how much gas mileage you got with this Sherman tank. Her voice wasn't perfect, so she wanted me to ask that.
Really good question. So the Sherman got about 2 to 2.5 miles per gallon on a good day on a flat road. The mileage really varies a lot because if you're going across country, your mileage tanks really quickly. 160 gallons was the average size of a tank, especially on the M4A4. That was rated as being roughly 100-mile range, but they're assuming that in cross-country driving. So that's about the equivalent. That means that an American armored division with roughly 200 tanks consumes something on the order of about 40,000 gallons of gas a day to keep them running. Now, the other issue on that is since you didn't exactly have gas tanks out there, those gallons of gas were 5-gallon jerry cans that the crew would actually have to open up and pour into a 1 5-gallon can at a time. Think about how long it's going to take for 160 gallons. So you got the crew of 5 men, one guy standing pouring, one guy catching the cans, and 2 others handing the cans up with a truck filled with jerry cans handing them over. So imagine the hard work it would be to keep them operating. Good question.
My name is Don Johnson. 2 questions. First, easy, short answer. What was the name of the product that we put on the tank treads to make them wider here in Evansville?
That's not as easy a question as you might think. We officially built what were called grousers. Okay? There's 2 different things. There's grousers and there's duckbills. Grouser goes across the whole span of the track and bolts to the outside of the track to widen it. What was used most heavily in the field were called duckbills. They go on the outside of the track and they'd be shaped like a playing card that's curled up, and they'd pound goes into the end of each track length. And those would bend over time, but that would also spread the weight in muddy terrain and in snow. And we did use those throughout not only World War II, but also the Korean War. Good question.
Thank you. The second is, did tanks have interchangeable barrels and were the chamber and the barrel one piece, or were those 2 separate pieces?
Depending on which nation you're talking about, both conditions apply. In terms of the Sherman, you actually pulled the entire gun out, which included the chamber. And yes, you had to worry about how fast they loaded. The other issue with the high velocity cannons like the 88, the longer barrel 75s from the German Panzer IVs, is that if you fire too many rounds, you eventually strip the rifling out of it. With the high explosive, the lower velocity on 75s, you didn't have nearly as much of a problem with that. Next question. Yes. There's a guy, okay, that's you right there setting up.
Okay. Could you use the Sherman in indirect fire?
Really, really good question. Thank you for asking that. The short answer is yes. So to help people understand, it's a really good question on a bunch of different levels. Indirect fire is what they call it when you're not shooting at a target directly in front of you, but an observer is saying, there's an enemy position out of your visibility. Can you elevate your gun and fire it so it will actually hit your target? The problem was you didn't always need tanks for direct fire. So oftentimes, tanks and later American tank destroyers would be used for indirect fire. Now, why can you do that? The one thing I haven't talked about is range. The Sherman has 75mm cannon. We've talked about that. How great do you think the range is on one of those? Any guesses? 2 miles, you say? You're actually closing in on it. The American 75 was based on the World War I French 75mm field piece that had a range of 6.8 miles. Now, in a tank, you're normally firing directly at what you can see, so that limits things down. But if you set the barrel up like this, you can fire out to 4 or 5 miles, and you have somebody called a forward observer who has a radio or a telephone, and he watches your rounds fire in and makes corrections. In the case of the tank destroyers, because the Germans didn't attack us very often, oftentimes they were used to do indirect fire as well. And so what's happening is you're actually doubling the artillery capability of the artillery component of the division. And so that was done very heavily, especially the last part of the war. So really good question, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, Tom Barron. Two things, I know we're talking mainly about the war. I was in Vietnam, I'm sure several guys here were. For about 1 week, I was in infantry, and we were securing, what tank did they use there in Vietnam? Do you remember? And also they used what they called the beehive round that looked like a dartboard when we went to get the VA, the NBA, you know. But what kind of tank was that? Do you know? I don't remember. I rode on them. That was one good thing. We didn't have to walk. We got to ride with it, and then get in combat. We'd have to jump off. But explain that. What that?
Okay. So a couple parts to answer your question. First thing is, at the end of World War II, we introduced what I briefly mentioned, the M26 Pershing tank, which changed the running gear or suspension into what's called torsion bar suspension. It used a 90mm cannon. That was later superseded by the M47 and the M48 Patton tank. That's what was primarily used by the ARVN troops. Right about the beginning of the Vietnam War, and especially at the tail end of it, some of the American tanks were M60s, which were basically the enlarged version of the M48. In fact, M47s, M48s, and M60s are all called Patton tanks. Now, the M47 and M48 had a 90mm gun. The M60 had a 105mm gun, which is roughly a 4-inch diameter, so it fires a bigger projectile. The beehive range we're talking about doesn't fire high explosive, nor does it fire shrapnel. It fires what they call flechettes. Think of a little dart that's about this long and about 3 times the size of the ink pen that you have. So if I pull out my pen,
They made these at Evansville Whirlpool, right?
something about this size with fins on the back. And what you do is in your barrel, you stack like 150 or 200 or 300 of these. So in 105, you probably have 4 layers of them, and they'd all be coned around. And when you fire, it's like a giant, shotgun. Only instead of firing shot, it's firing all these pellets, and it's firing them at rifle velocity. Now, you aim that towards the enemy, and you fire it, and it doesn't matter if they're hiding behind trunks or in the jungle or whatever, they're not going to get cover for that. And you're right, it's like looking at a dartboard. And it was tremendously hellacious on whoever got hit by them. They still have beehive rounds today.
And they made those in Evansville Whirlpool, correctly?
I believe that's the case, and I know also down at Gibbs they produced flechettes, and they also produced bomblets for cluster bombs. So there's all kinds of wartime production throughout. This lady here had a question. I'll get to you in a moment in the back. We got one over there too, so.
Okay, you were talking about refueling the tanks. Now, did the people with the gas, did they come, like, were they right directly behind the tanks? And how were they protected, and what side, how much fuel did those trucks or whatever hold for, that went to the tanks?
So my first answer is protection. And I'm not being facetious. So the work was done by the tank crews. You had the tank, or the truck drivers would drive 6x6 trucks, excuse me, and you probably have 100, 150 of jerry cans per truck bed. And essentially the truck driver and one of the tank crewmen would hand those jerry cans to the next guy who would run the jerry cans to the next beside the tank. And then you'd have one guy pouring out the gas and one guy on top pitching it. And then when they're empty, they'd throw them in the back of the truck and it would drive off. And actually, for us in the North French campaign, most of the truck drivers, or many of the truck drivers, were black soldiers. They were what they called the Red Ball Express. And actually to provide support, because we hadn't captured the port until late in the summer of 1944. So all the supplies that went to all the troops fighting in the front came by the trucks. And so they actually set road regulations where one road would be one way only, all trucks going to the front, and another parallel road would be all trucks coming back from the front to pick up more stuff, and they'd be going around. And because the advance was so quick, a lot of German stragglers got left behind, and oftentimes they would try to ambush the troops. And so you'll actually see reference to a lot of the truck drivers talking about driving through what they call engine territory, because you never know when you'd be shot at. You'd have a convoy of 100, 150, 200 trucks. So it was very dangerous, and a lot of casualties ensued. Good question. There.
Well, you're very knowledgeable about this.
Thank you.
Were you by any chance in a tank infantry? Or in a tank, or in the service?
So the short answer to that is no, I never served. I am a military historian, and by virtue of being a volunteer at the Patton Museum, they would every summer do a demonstration battle where tanks would fight against infantry. The people that maintained the tanks, drove the tanks, and operated the equipment in the tanks during the battle were the volunteers. So the volunteers had to be trained by the military in order to be able to safely operate those. I was one of those volunteers.
Do you wish you would have been in the tank, Billy?
I'll be really honest. I feel very bad sometimes that I did not serve. On the other hand, I'm glad I didn't serve under fire. Because the sad side is, think about what happens, and I didn't talk about this in the lecture, but on average, by the studies done by the United States Army, every time a Sherman tank got hit at a 5-man crew, average is at least one crew member died or was seriously wounded every time a Sherman got stopped. Now, how do you die? If you're lucky, it's a projectile that goes through you. As often as not, it's what the British used to call a brew-up, which means the tank's inside catches fire, the explosives inside. If you look at footage from Ukraine today, you see a lot of pictures of tank turrets stuck in a field away from the tank. What happened is all the ammunition went off at the same time and it blew the turret out. You can pretty well figure out what happened to the crews on those. So I'm glad I didn't have to face that.
Well, even if you never, you're doing a good job.
Thank you very much.
So
That's part of my mission in many ways. If I didn't serve, I could at least hopefully enlighten people as to what service entailed and what service was like. In the back there, in the black hat. Yes.
Yes, sir. What year did the Bouncing Betty come out? My name is Rick Beatty.
So this is a non-tank question. The Bouncing Betty is what we used to refer to as one of the German mines, sometimes referred to as the shoe mine. It first came into use by the Germans in 1942. We ran into it in the fighting in Tunisia and following. What it is a mine that sits on top of a small powder charge. When you trip the mine, the first explosive fires the mine up in the air 6 or 7 feet, and it then explodes. so that all the shrapnel goes out like this. Well, if I step on a mine and it blows my foot off, the rest of me is relatively safe. If it jumps into the air about this height and explodes, everybody catches pieces of shrapnel. It was very, very hard on the troops. So it was a very unpleasant mine, and a lot of American troops hated it. And mines were very heavily used by the Germans, and by the Americans and British too, but by the Germans as a way to deny territory. And so one of the things you would do is you would actually stop people by putting a lot of mines out. There was another question over
here, right back here.
back is, and then
Here.
I actually had two questions. The first one is, I have read that the total wartime production by Germany of Panthers and both types of tigers, Tiger 1, Tiger 2, all put together, was less than 7,000. I'm assuming that a fair percentage of those went to Russia, and a lot of those never came back. Do you have any rough idea of what percentage of Tiger and Panther tanks were sent to the Eastern Front?
yes, and it's a very complex question. So I'm going to unpack it a little bit here. First thing is, during World War II, the Germans produced, depending on whose statistics you look at, roughly 1,400 to 1,500 Tiger 1s, and roughly 400 to 600 Tiger 2s, the King Tigers. They produced, again, roughly 6,200 and some Panther tanks. There were 3 different varieties of Panthers, Model D, then A, then G. Currently, we know of, I believe, about 16 or 17 extant Tigers of one stripe or another, maybe 20. So not many of them survived the war. A lot of times, like I said, they're destroyed by their own forces. Now, depending on which year you're talking about, the Germans put the bulk of their army into the Eastern Front. And so, through most of the war, except for the run-up to the Battle of the Bulge, the German tank forces were roughly 50 to 60% in the Eastern Front, roughly 20 to 30% in the West. There's about 10 or 15% in Germany that's going through training. Now, the Germans also took over a lot of captured tanks, like the French tank park and a number of British tanks that were captured in the Dunkirk campaign, or the fall of France. And so what happened was, the Germans would build modifications of a lot of those and still keep running those training tanks. And a lot of the tanks that were being produced would go to the Russian front. The tanks that were on the Western front were oftentimes hybrids that were being used as training tanks. So the numbers are kind of hard and slippery to fit on, but I'd say for the bulk of 41, 42, 43, 60+% of the German tanks were in the Eastern Front. In 44, it breaks down to about 50% to 40%. By 45, it goes back up to about 65 or 70% on the Russian front, and the rest facing the Western Allies. So I guess that's a complicated question. Thank you.
The second question was, I believe a lot of the Shermans, the main armament cannons were hydromatically stabilized.
That is correct. And we were the first country to do that.
How effective, was that used much in combat, and how effective was it?
No, and partially. So what he's talking about is, think about being in a tank, and as it's riding across country, the barrel does this. That means in order to be able to accurately fire, especially the longer barrels for the higher velocity, you have to stop, acquire your target, wait till it's stabilized, and then fire it. We used a hydraulic system inside the Sherman that would absorb a lot of that recoil, so the gun would stay like this, and you could fire with some accuracy, short range, without stopping. Most tanks stop most of the time to fire. The Russians, as it turned out, trained their tanks to just fire a lot, even if they fired on the move and most of the shots missed. The problem is, you have a problem inside the tank. There's only so much room for ammunition. So as I said on the Sherman, with a 75, you have 97 rounds. and a Russian T-34 is about 70 rounds. We start firing them promiscuously, and then when you get in the real tank versus tank part, you've only got 10 or 12 rounds left. What do? Go, hey, pause, wait, I need refill. Don't shoot at me. I'm going to go home now. That doesn't happen that way. So the stabilization helped in that it reduced the width of the swings. Now, if you look at a modern M1, the stabilization is so good, I've actually seen footage of a tank rotating into a gun that's focused on target. Now, we can do that now with the newer technology. Almost nobody had any kind of stabilization like that other than the American Shermans. And of course, the M26 is when they came out. So that's what that is.
The sequence to that, how many Shermans did the United States make in World War II? How many Russian tanks, how many Japanese tanks, how many German tanks total? Exact numbers.
Exact numbers you're not going to get from me because I'm doing it off by memory. Roughly, the Germans produced roughly 26,000 tanks during the war. That includes tanks and what they call tank destroyers or tank hunters or self-propelled guns based on tank chassis. We produced about 110, 115,000 overall. The Russians about 70,000. The British 18,000, maybe a little, probably closer to 16,000. The Japanese about 4,000. Maybe a little less than that, but probably about 4,000. And the Italians, which we oftentimes forget about, they probably had about 4,000, a little less than 4,000 as well. So that gives you an idea of the scope.
We have one more question because we're calling it.
Yes, you've been waiting for one.
I was on an M48 tank, and we had a radio, a telephone on the back of the tank where the infantry could call in for help. When did they add that feature on the tanks?
Such a good question. Thank you for asking. The hardest part of combined arms is everybody has to talk with one another. And in World War II, the infantry radio did not interface with the tank radio. So it turns out during the fighting in what they call the bocage, the hedgerows just outside of Normandy, we had a problem of being able to communicate between the tanks that were supporting the infantrymen and the infantrymen. And somebody came up with a clever idea, and I don't know the name of the guy that did it. They would take a 30 caliber ammo can and they'd weld it to the back of the Sherman, and they'd put a handheld telephone that would be wired into the turret. And an infantry officer would pick up the telephone and call up, "Hi guy, I want you to adjust your fire, please." Obviously you'd say it differently, but that's how they would do it. By the time of Vietnam, that was fairly standard, so the infantry could cooperate with the tanks and vice versa. The other issue is, it's also important for the tanks to know where the dangers are. The infantry can oftentimes see the hidden anti-tank guns and so forth before the tankers can. Good question.
One of the things, the term jerry can.
Why is it called jerry
You
can?
know, it was invented by the Germans, and we actually it wasn't a real good idea. And going back to it,
Exactly. And in fact, the British also had metal containers they would hold their gas in, and the British troops called theirs the flimsies because they were so badly made, they leaked all the time, and they would bend and break, and they were essentially just square tin cans that weren't strong enough to hold the contents in. And so, yes, what did the British call the Germans? They called them the jerrys. Hence, it's jerry cans because the design was so good and so strong. Do you have another question?
Dr. Bazal loaned me a book about General Rolls. General Rolls, and can you just summarize in a couple of sentences about General Rolls, probably one of the best tank generals in World War II, and nobody knows about it.
So a lot of things can be said about General Maurice Rose. He was an American general, a tanker, went through Fort Knox. He was also Jewish. He was one of the few high-ranking Jewish officers in the United States Army. He is very good at selecting subordinates. He was very supportive of his subordinates. And he very much had a headquarters that moved with a Jeep, 3 Jeeps to be precise. So he was always at the point of contact so he could organize his entire division on what he saw. He was very much the equivalent in that attitude of Rommel. Unfortunately, near the end of the war, just outside the German tank school at Paderborn, he was involved in a firefight. His Sherman was hit. He got out of the Sherman. When the Germans came for him to surrender, he tried to surrender, and what people that were there said was that as he was trying to unbuckle his belt to drop the .45, the Germans got terrified and they fired at him and shot him and killed him. And if you go to the National Museum of the United States Army, one of the things that they pilfered from Fort Knox, the Pat Museum at Fort Knox, was General Rose's helmet was safe. It used to be on display. So that's a whole bunch of stuff all at once.
I know the ship. The troop ships they had to take across the Atlantic were named after Army generals, and one of them I rode on was the Rose. Took it from Brooklyn to Bremerhaven.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you for your service. And for all you veterans out there, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Kevin. Excellent talk. See you guys in 2 weeks.
One last thing. If anybody wants to come and look at any of this here and wants to look through the office, please feel free to do so. Please come up the ramp, that's the safest way, and I'm here to